There was a time in this country when a 16-year-old with a mop and a paper hat was as American as a drive-in on a Friday night. You knew somebody who worked at the Dairy Queen, or the Shell station, or the Five and Dime on Main Street. Maybe that somebody was you. You showed up on Saturday morning, you clocked in, you smelled like fryer grease or motor oil by noon, and at the end of the week somebody handed you a small envelope with your name on it, and inside that envelope was money you had earned with your own two hands. That feeling, that particular, unrepeatable feeling of the first paycheck, doesn't exist the same way it once did. And if you've looked around lately and wondered where all the teenage workers went, you're not imagining it. They really did disappear. And the story of how that happened says something profound about who we used to be, and who we've quietly become. Let's go back. In the post-war years, the teenage part-time job was so common it barely warranted comment. It was simply what you did. You turned 15 or 16, you found something, bagging groceries, pumping gas, delivering newspapers before the sun came up, scooping ice cream, mowing the neighbors' lawns until you had enough regulars to call it a small business. The idea wasn't controversial or optional. It was a rite of passage as expected as learning to drive. Your parents had worked. Their parents had worked since they were old enough to hold a broom. Work was not something that competed with your life. Work was how you entered it. The numbers bear this out in a way that's almost startling. Back in the late 1970s, more than half of all American teenagers held some kind of job. By some counts it was closer to 57% of teens between 16 and 19 working at any given time. The burger joints needed them. The grocery chains needed them. Gas stations, movie theaters, hardware stores, amusement parks, the entire American retail and service economy had quietly built itself on the assumption that there would always be a fresh crop of willing young people ready to show up and do the work that the economy needed done at the lower end of the wage scale. For decades, that assumption held. And then, slowly and then all at once, it didn't. By the time the 2010s arrived, teenage employment had fallen to somewhere around a third of what it once was. Today, fewer than 1 in 3 teenagers holds a part-time job during the school year. In some parts of the country, in some demographics, the numbers are even lower than that. And the reasons behind this collapse are layered and tangled in ways that don't lend themselves to easy villains or simple explanations. This isn't a story about laziness. It's a story about a society that changed its mind, quietly, gradually, without ever quite admitting what it was doing, about what teenagers are for. Part of the story is academic pressure, and how thoroughly it has expanded to fill every available hour of a young person's life. The American high school experience of the 1960s and 1970s was rigorous in places, but it was not the relentless credentialing machine it has since become. College admission was competitive at the elite schools, but for most kids, getting into a decent university was not the consuming, years-long campaign it is today. You didn't need a curated portfolio of extracurriculars, community service hours, standardized test prep courses, and AP classes stacked 6 deep. You could hold a job at the Pizza Hut and still get into a good school. Nobody looked at your resume and wondered why you'd wasted your afternoons flipping dough instead of founding a nonprofit. Something shifted. Somewhere along the way, the college admissions process became a kind of second job all by itself, one that demanded the same hours a real job would have taken, except it didn't pay anything and the returns were speculative. Parents began steering their teenagers away from minimum wage work and toward activities that would look better on an application. Sports became year-round. Music lessons intensified. Academic tutoring filled the gaps. The part-time job, which had once been considered a mark of good character and work ethic, began to be seen in certain circles as a distraction. Something you did if you had to, not something you did because it was good for you. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the shift in attitude toward teen employment didn't happen uniformly across American society. It happened differently depending on where you lived and how much money your family had. Working-class kids never entirely stopped working. They still took jobs at McDonald's and Walmart and the local car wash, often out of genuine necessity, often contributing to household expenses in ways that their more affluent peers never had to consider. But the cultural signal that came from the top of the economic ladder, from the prep school parents and the college counselors and the glossy magazines about raising successful children, was unmistakable. Work was for people who needed to work. Ambitious, college-bound kids had better things to do. At the same time that teen labor was being quietly devalued in the cultural imagination, something else was happening on the other side of the economy. The jobs that teenagers had traditionally filled were becoming more complicated. Liability laws tightened. Minimum wages rose, which was good for workers, but it also meant employers became choosier about who they hired. They wanted reliability. They wanted availability. They wanted people who could work nights and weekends without a parent calling to rearrange the schedule. A 30-year-old without homework was simply a more practical hire than a 16-year-old with midterms. Some industries that had once been teen employment staples, gas stations, for one, had automated themselves into near irrelevance. You didn't need a kid in a uniform to pump your gas anymore. You swiped your card and pumped it yourself. The machine replaced the job, and nobody wrote an elegy for it. And then came the screens. This is the part of the conversation that makes some people uncomfortable because it risks sliding into generational finger wagging, and that's not what this is. But it would be dishonest to tell the story of the disappearing teen job without mentioning what filled the hours that work used to occupy. Smartphones arrived. Social media arrived. Streaming arrived. The entire architecture of digital entertainment was built, quite deliberately, to be as absorbing and as time-consuming as possible. Teenagers who might once have been bored enough on a Tuesday afternoon to walk down to the grocery store and ask about a bag boy position were now absorbed in a social and entertainment world that existed entirely inside a 4-inch screen. The pull of that world was, and is, enormous. It doesn't mean teenagers became lazy. It means the competition for their attention got extraordinarily fierce, and sitting on a couch refreshing a feed requires no effort and delivers immediate rewards in a way that folding shirts at the Gap simply cannot match. There's also the question of what was lost when the teenager stepped out of the workforce, and this part of the story tends to get overlooked in all the economic hand-wringing. Because the teenage job was never really just about the money. It was about something harder to quantify. It was about learning to show up when you didn't feel like it. Learning to deal with a difficult customer without saying what you actually thought. Learning to work alongside people who were nothing like you, older, from different backgrounds, with different lives, and find a way to get the job done together. It was about the particular dignity of earning your own money and deciding what to do with it, even if what you decided to do with it was foolish. It was about failure and recovery in a low-stakes environment, where the worst thing that could happen was that you got fired from the Burger King and had to find something else. It was practice. It was the first rehearsal for adult life, played out in the fluorescent light of a stockroom or the open air of a parking lot, and for several generations of Americans it was so commonplace that nobody thought to call it character building. It just was what it was. It was a job. The teenagers who worked in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s carried something with them out of those years that's harder to come by now. Not money, not credentials, something more like a felt knowledge of how the working world actually operates. Of what it costs to produce $1. Of how long a shift feels when the clock on the wall seems to have stopped. Of what it's like to have a boss who doesn't particularly care whether you're having a good day. These aren't comfortable lessons, but they're real ones. And a generation that largely skipped them has arrived at adulthood with remarkable credentials and, in some cases, a genuine unfamiliarity with the weight of those simple, stubborn facts. This isn't nostalgia for struggle. Nobody needs to romanticize the experience of working a dead-end job at 15 for minimum wage in an era when minimum wage was barely worth the paper the check was printed on. But there's something in the fading of that experience that feels like more than just an economic shift. It feels like a quiet renegotiation of what we expect of our young people, and whether we still believe that useful work, real, ordinary, unglamorous work, is one of the ways a young person becomes an adult worth knowing. We used to believe that. Across every decade from the Depression through the Reagan years, regardless of class or region or politics, the broad consensus was that putting a teenager to work was one of the best things you could do for them. The neighborhood kid who showed up mowed your lawn, the counter girl who knew every regular's order, the stock boy who stayed late without being asked, these were understood as the good kind of kid. The kind who would be alright. We've changed our minds about a lot of things since then. Some of those changes are progress. But this one is worth sitting with for a while. Because somewhere out there, there's a Dairy Queen that runs just fine without a 16-year-old in a paper hat. And something about that feels like a loss that doesn't quite have a name.